So I appreciate very much, Tori, the introduction and the opportunity to speak to a lot of the companies that are located in your region. I just wanted to open up by saying that I work all over the world, and I do a lot of work with the various World Trade Centers in a lot of the different cities. But I would say that World Trade Center Denver is at the top of that list of the WTCs that do a really good job. They have a very professional staff. The staff has significant skill sets in international business. They're very responsive and very, very capable. They have some really great programs that are out there besides this conversation that we're going to have today. And really, at the end of the day, they make connections. They really are a great source for resources in international business. They provide timely information, such as the format and program we're going to talk about today. And lastly, they provide some significant training to up everybody's skill sets in international business. At the end of the day, I like to think that they really open the world for the companies that are located in your geographic area. So a little bit about my company and myself is that I work for a company called Blue Tiger International. It's a successor company to a company that was started in the early 1980s. It's been involved in global supply chain management. We're consultants. We help companies navigate all the challenges as well as the opportunities in international business. We work with companies that principally have an international footprint as an importer or an exporter or have interest in foreign markets. The key concept of the conversation that we're going to have today is reducing risk and spend in the global supply chain. And part of that is creating really very specifically 5 strategies for companies to think about how they can lower risk and lower cost in their global footprint. So landed cost is a big issue, identifying and mitigating risk, reviewing the various options that are available. And we, over the years, have created as many as 15 options for companies in global supply chain, and I'll share many of them with you. And talk a little bit about foreign trade zones, tariff engineering, and drawback programs as key areas where there's a lot of opportunity to view risk and spend. For all of us coming out of the pandemic the last 3 years, we have to kind of just venture back a little bit, even though for most of us it's in our rearview mirror, because COVID created a significant amount of delay, it created a significant amount of cost, and it created a significant amount of uncertainty in global supply chain. And that uncertainty, to some extent, still exists today, but fortunately, obviously, in our rearview mirror are the delays and the cost escalations that we once saw. One of the issues that we always make point referencing is that while things have gotten significantly better relative to the transportation infrastructure of the world, being able to move things much more responsibly, and most suppliers around the world also being able to create products when we need them rather than having the huge delays that we saw through COVID. A lot of people who are economists, people who study geopolitical, really believe that with all the disruption in the supply chain that is starting to exist in the world, such as the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine event, the tensions in the Far East, now we have this issue in the Middle East that's getting a little bit out of control, that we all need to be very careful of what's going to happen down the road. And while we've seen the delays dissipate and we've seen the costs come down to pre-COVID positions, a lot of the speculation is that probably sometimes towards the end of the first quarter of 2024, that we expect to see a certain amount of imbalance between demand and capacity, meaning that demand will start to outpace capacity, and therefore the delays will start to creep in, and also the cost of the transportation in the global market will start to increase as well. So as I go through the discussion outline, which is outlined with this PowerPoint presentation, at any point in time, if you have a question or you have a comment, and you're welcome to challenge anything that I put out there in this discussion, feel free to jump into the chat, Tori will, let me know about it, and we can address it as we go through the presentation to create that interaction as if we were in a classroom setting. So besides the impact and the residual impact of the COVID era, we have things that we have to deal with on a regular basis that we consider significant challenges in international business. Political issues, economic issues, culture, the political environment that we currently are involved with, the various disruptions which occur. Obviously, we've been dealing with the Ukraine-Russia conflict for a year and a half, and we now have this big concern that's going on in the Middle East. Appreciate the fact that Middle Eastern companies in the supply chain, in the ocean freight world and the air freight world, control anywhere around 10 to 12% of the capacity in the world in moving freight. Saudi Airlines is a big cargo airline, okay? Zim Container Line is a big ocean freight container line. So there is a concern, and we're watching it very carefully, whether or not the events in the Middle East are going to have an impact in the ability for the capacity to maybe maintain where it is today. We have financial concerns, climate, weather changes, the frequency of loss and damage that occurs in goods that move internationally. We have the fact in what we refer to as carrier management, is that airlines and trucking companies, steamship lines, have a very difficult time managing themselves through a disruption, and therefore that uncertainty in their business models create a significant imbalance in their ability to provide the capacity necessary at the time that's needed, and also to control the stabilization of their pricing. Freight, duty, and taxes as goods move through the borders of the world, okay? And the fact is that many supply chain executives are constantly chasing lower costs in their business models. So all these things become challenges and issues that we have to deal with. I'm kind of framing these things because these are the things that I'm going to speak to as I start to share with you some of the concepts and solutions that we have. Appreciate the fact that when we look at global supply chain, we have to look at all modes of transportation, including warehousing and distribution. It impacts all countries around the world, even though some of us may be involved in very specific trade lanes. When we look at the whole world and the economy, we're really touching well over more than 120 countries on a daily basis on goods moving in and out of the United States. It impacts all business models. Doesn't make a difference what vertical you're in. If you have involved with a global footprint somewhere, okay, it impacts almost every industry and every business model. Within organizations, it impacts every level, from senior management, who's trying to make strategic decisions and providing the direction a company should be heading in, to purchasing and procurement, sales and customer service, operations and manufacturing, where supply chain sits, and finance and legal, obviously, is the residual impact of the things that happen in global supply chain. One of the positive things that has happened as a result of COVID is the fact that the role of the supply chain, and therefore the role of the supply chain manager in corporations, has been elevated. Supply chain became a household word as COVID peaked, because everybody was impacted by the delays and the cost increases, and even to this day, the cost increases, which we see in the form of inflation, okay, impact every household. So supply chain is elevated at the daily level that we deal with, but within corporations, the more important thing is that most senior executives have recognized now the importance that supply chain is to their organization. And therefore, we like to use the term that supply chain managers now have a seat at the table, not necessarily being part of the C-suite, but certainly have access to the C-suite. Okay, and we've seen a lot of companies create the chief of global supply chain as a C-suite position. Impacts relative to the supply chain fall into demand planning. And appreciate demand planning was one of the big impacts that occurred in corporations all over the world as a result of COVID. The difficulty in trying to figure out, when we order something, how long is it going to take to be supplied by the supplier, and how long is it going to actually take to get from the supplier to point of utilization. The concept of resiliency and sustainability in every company was challenged through the COVID period. And now, as we get into this great, what we refer to as a reset, okay, those are big goals of every company, and bouncing back, okay, and changing methodology and operational aspects in their organizations, okay, to create a much more sustainable supply chain. It has impacted sales and business development. If you're not getting your goods on time to manufacture or to distribute, very difficult to honor business development commitments or even try to grow business development opportunities. And appreciate that personnel, the ability to hire good people is very difficult today in most marketplaces around the world. Even at the mid-level of blue-collar manufacturing level is a very difficult hire today. We're going to talk a little bit about nearshoring and the concept of bringing manufacturing back to the United States. Conceptually, that sounds really good, but if you don't have the ability to have skilled labor and labor availability to fill in those positions, that becomes an issue all by itself. We have a particular case currently in Oklahoma City where we helped the company through the 90s outsource a lot of its manufacturing to various Asian markets, particularly China. And about the beginning of COVID, the company saw its vulnerabilities in that marketplace. So they asked us to create a model to bring back the manufacturing to the United States. And we created a foreign trade zone in their manufacturing location in Oklahoma City. And they needed about 80 to 100 positions filled within that capacity. And this is almost a year ago. We're still struggling to bring in skilled labor in that market for those positions. So it becomes an important consideration. And also appreciate that the model of personnel has changed in company with so many people still working from home and these hybrid models that are trying to be created where people have a balancing act between working so many days at home and so many days in the office. That also has an impact on how decisions are made relative to supply chain activity. One of the key factors in supply chain that was a big thing probably from the late 1980s all the way through till pre-COVID was trying to create lean manufacturing, lean inventory management systems in your supply chain. A lot of time it was referred to as just-in-time inventory. And the reality is that COVID killed just-in-time inventory because the levels of safety stocks had to be increased so dramatically in order to meet the supplier, the customer's needs, and to meet the supply for manufacturing, that you were just happy to get goods in. You were trying to have as much as you needed as potentially possible. Appreciate the fact that in the United States, inventory balances rose by as much as 40% in some supply chains because of that whole concept. And there's still a residual impact, even as we come out of COVID, that a lot of companies are maintaining a much higher level safety stock than they ever have before. So it impacts how purchasing and procurement operate their responsibilities, how all aspects in the supply chain, particularly logistics and freight areas and inventory management, manage their responsibilities. And then it has a residual impact relative into customer service and the ability for a company to grow and develop its business, both here in the United States and in overseas markets. Other factors come into play, which is freight cost versus service. A lot of companies and the logistics managers chased inexpensive shipping as a continual pattern. As COVID hit, a lot of companies were just happy to be able to get availability of space, particularly in the ocean freight market, and they were paying extreme pricing. Appreciate the fact that in December of 2019, to move a 40-foot container from China to the west coast of the United States may have cost around $2,700. Okay, in the peak of COVID, that same container could have cost the same importer as much as $25,000 to $27,000, almost 10 times the increase in cost. So a lot of companies now have created a much more balancing act between the price that they pay and really focusing on a higher quality of service. The terminology we like to use is getting greater value for your spend not necessarily the cheapest. Remote working, particularly in the supply chain, has had a huge impact. Okay. The political discourse and the political issues that are occurring not only here in the United States, as we all know, we have a House divided pretty significantly. Okay. But we also have geopolitical issues all over the world. We know we have the problem in Ukraine and Russia, and we now have this serious problem, and we all hope and pray not for any more of an escalation in the Middle East. Obtaining talent for companies, particularly in supply chain, have been significantly difficult. Okay. And appreciate that we're battling social compliance issues, environmental issues, energy and water issues, and general resources to the organization. In the area of social compliance, one of the issues that I just would like to mention is that under the Biden administration, laws that have been in place for many years have now been elevated to the top of the list, particularly as it relates to what we refer to as forced labor issues. So this means that Customs now has integrated social compliance into its management responsibilities, and therefore is now very concerned about forced labor being utilized in any aspect of manufacturing or distribution in foreign markets before the goods arrive here in the United States. As a matter of fact, Customs now, in the last 18 months, has seized as much as $3 billion worth of goods coming out of China, particularly the western part of China, where there's indications that forced labor is being used in various slave and worker camps. Okay. And these merchandise is being seized, and the importer has to now battle with Customs in evidencing that, in fact, slave labor wasn't used in the manufacturing process. And Customs is not just looking at the primary manufacturers overseas, but they're looking at their tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 suppliers who supply them raw materials and components. The automobile industry, the textile industry, fashion industry, solar panel industry has been dramatically affected as particular verticals relative to this forced labor issue, particularly as it relates to China. But appreciate that forced labor issues not only exist in China, they exist throughout the world. We even have issues here in the United States. But key areas would be China, certain countries in West Africa, and certain countries in Latin America have been clearly defined where this problem is more serious. Mentioned solar panels just in a moment. So we had a company in the West Coast that had 40 containers coming in from China seized and put into a detention circumstance, something worth close to $20 million worth of solar panels and solar panel equipment. And the particular storyline here that Customs used is that in the glass manufacturing component of solar panels, they require a certain type of silicate. The silicate comes from sand, and the sand comes from mines that are in the western part of China that are located in areas where there's a predominance of forced labor concerns. So the seizure took place not just on the basis that Customs could evidence and prove that forced labor was in there, but only that it was indicated that it's possibly a result of forced labor. And therefore now this client of ours, this customer, has now the obligation and responsibility to do a mapping of their whole supply chain to provide evidence to Customs that in fact forced labor wasn't used in the supply chain. So this is becoming a major issue for companies to pay attention to. I'm going on Monday to speak in Washington at a conference that's just addressing this issue on the forced labor issues around the world. And at the end of the day, what it really is requiring that is that companies become significantly more diligent in the vetting of their suppliers and the vetting of their suppliers' suppliers to make sure proactively that there's no forced labor, and providing that evidence proactively to Customs before the goods are actually shipped and imported. Other things to think about is that COVID is still present, and also there's a residual impact still facing us in COVID. China, which obviously is a huge country with lots of different people, lots of different cities all throughout their country, they still have a problem in certain areas where COVID outbreaks take place. They have a zero tolerance policy which means that once it occurs, it reaches a certain level, they lock down that area. They bring in the military to provide assurances that nobody will leave their homes, businesses are closed, schools are closed, all transportation infrastructure is closed. It's locked down. If you have a supplier that's located in any of those areas, this can become a very serious issue. Just recently, in an outside community outside of Ningbo in China, this happened just only 60 days ago. The political rhetoric associated with China, North Korea, and Iran obviously has consequences. The risks of the inflation, the high cost of money. Just 3 years ago, the internal rate of return for money in corporations in the United States was around 2.25%. Okay, it's now as high as 11 to 12% in most companies. That's a huge growth in that number, which means the cost of borrowing is that much higher and the cost of investment is that much more expensive, which kind of retards the concept of investment. We now know that the feds are getting involved in the supply chain. The FMC is investigating a number of companies. They have a number of cases based on whether the carriers, in their price increases, whether it was justified, how they allocated delays and costs, demurrage calculations, things like that are all being challenged. And not only here in this country, but in other countries around the world that were greatly impacted during COVID are all looking at their federal controls that they have and where violations may have occurred. And as I mentioned a few times now, the Ukraine-Russia conflict obviously calls in geopolitical concerns, straining supply chains all over the world and resources, not only through Western Europe, but here in the United States, now being totally replaced by what's going on in the Middle East. So we also have to think about that there are particular industries, and particular industries have their own set of challenges and complications. We did work recently for a company in the life sciences biopharma issue. And when we did the analysis, we had to look at some of the things that they have that are unique to them. And the reason I point this out is not specifically to this industry, but to recognize that each specific industry has uniqueness, and that uniqueness and those nuances has to be brought into the equation of looking at risk and cost. So in this particular issue for life sciences and biopharma, the movement and the amount of time involved in that movement is critical. Temperature and humidity of certain products is a very important issue, which means that as the goods move through the supply chain, they have to be done quickly in terms of time. It has to be done where the temperature is within a range, and that the humidity is a certain range as well, because certain products require that or they'll spoil. Chain of custody, which is making sure that the goods are protected very tightly through the supply chain from point A all the way to point of utilization. A lot of biopharma, life science companies are very concerned about the companies that they do business with as service providers and carriers have green initiatives. Cleanliness and hygienic procedures in place to make sure that as the products move through the system, that they're not exposed to any harmful bacteria or harmful circumstances created in their handling environment. Appreciate the fact that they have other government agencies that they have to be concerned with, principally the FDA here in the United States and their related counterparts in overseas markets. We have the CDC, okay? You have the ATF, you have all these different organizations and government agencies that manage import and export activity. When we counted, we actually can tell you that there's about 28 federal agencies that get involved with import and export activity. A lot of biopharma companies and life science companies like to use the DDP Incoterm, delivered duty paid, where they take full responsibility end to end in the transaction. Okay, and that in itself causes lots of issues because you're now responsible for customs clearance, payment of duties and taxes, and the on-forwarding to a final destination. Quality control and maintaining a high level of quality control as the product moves through the system is another big issue. And appreciate that always in that particular industry, as is in the food industry as well, packing, marking, and labeling issues come into play as well. So again, I point this particular out that we have to bring into the equation not only the generic things that I've already talked about, but also the things that are unique to aspects of your supply chain. We hold out that the primary responsibility of people in supply chain is to really look at risk and spend and business process improvements as part of their job description. Okay, but obviously the last 3 years, those pillars have been somewhat put on hold, and survivability and sustainability have been the focus in most business models. But what we like to call the Great Reset is occurred now. Okay, and a lot of companies, are trying to, move forward fairly aggressively. Okay, and we say that you still have to plan correctly. You have to think about not necessarily eliminating all the risks, but really creating steps to mitigate those risks. How to do that generically is to develop resources, and the World Trade Center of Denver, who's hosting this event, is a really good resource for all these areas. Okay, you need to learn what your options are, and I'm going to share with you in future slides what some of those options are. You have to be able to get creative in how you approach some of these areas. You probably have to get into areas that are somewhat unfamiliar to you and your company. And you have to be patient through the process and plan both strategically and tactically to make a lot of these things happen. So as an example, what has come out of COVID and is now part of the Great Reset is really taking and raising the bar of managing suppliers much more vigorously. Increasing safety stock levels. I gave a similar presentation earlier in the week, and somebody asked me a question, what do we see companies doing? So in lean manufacturing, a lot of times safety stock levels are maintained in the 3 to 5% range, meaning that 3 to 5% of what is required to maintain opportunity, okay, is now that category of safety stock. But we're seeing more companies going into the 20 to as much as 30 and 40% of what they need in the safety stock, and that's where we see companies leveling out. And when you increase your safety stock to those higher levels, it's very difficult to really call yourself either just in time or really lean manufacturing. And obviously companies got shy as a result of COVID. So the knee-jerk reaction is really to maintain higher levels of safety stock. Whatever you have as your regular order time, you really need to be thinking about ordering in as much as 4 to 6 months in advance now. We are going to talk about diversifying your sourcing portfolio, but at the end of the day, you really need to think about increasing the number of suppliers and not putting all your eggs in one basket. Okay, obviously through COVID, the vulnerability of having single source suppliers was clearly in our face. Okay, so a lot of companies now are saying, well, you at least need 2 or 3 in particular lead commodities. And situations where a lot of companies looked in terms of reducing risk, but potentially ship direct to the customer. The example that I'd like to give is a medical products company that we worked with that's located in Cincinnati. And they source in China. They also source in Malaysia, some in Taiwan, a little bit in the Philippines. They bring these goods into a warehouse that's located in Riverside, California. And from that location in Riverside, California, they do distribution all over the United States. And there's a cost involved with bringing it into that location and then doing the distribution. So when we asked what actually gets done in that distribution facility, and there are really no processes that get done. There's a quality control process at the supplier's facility, so they don't even open the packaging of the boxes. It really is just a pass-through facility. So we made arrangements for their suppliers to put labels on the boxes and to create situations where when a container load came into the United States, it was already pre-marked on which customers it was going to, and then it was deconsolidated and handed off directly to various trucking companies, UPS, FedEx, and companies like that. And so they were direct delivered to the customer without having to go into a warehouse, which really didn't provide any specific value. So shipping directly to customers is one of the potential solutions. Export sales is up by around 6% in the United States, looking at pre-COVID numbers. And part of that is that COVID opened the door for U.S. suppliers. While we all around the world suffered relative to our supply chain, here in the United States, we suffered less than a lot of countries around the world. A lot of companies still have not come out of COVID entirely and have a lot of residual impact. That has opened the door for U.S. suppliers. Companies around the world said, I'd rather pay more for something and make sure I get it as compared to be paying less and rolling the dice whether I'm going to get it timely or not. A lot of governments around the world, like the United States, increased their spending dramatically, as did many countries around the world did as well. That foreign increased spending, a lot of that money was spent on products and services coming right out of the United States. Again, the key being that while we all had disruption, there was less disruption here, and we came out of the COVID thing much faster than a lot of countries around the world. And to recognize the fact that U.S. products, both those manufactured here and distributed from here, are still in high demand. And one of the reasons for that is our customer service and our quality control process is really second to none in the world today. When we look at landed cost, we break it down into 5 primary pillars or silos. The first is the acquisition cost of what we pay for the goods, the freight to move it from point A to point B, the customs clearance process and the cost associated with that, the duties and taxes that are paid as the goods come through the border, and appreciate that goods coming out of China that might be subject to the 301 tariffs that Trump put in place and Biden has maintained, add another 25% surcharge onto the duty payment, increasing the cost of purchase by 25%. That happened in 2017 and continues now here as we exited 2023 and going into 2024. And there's no sign that the Biden administration, even though he ran on the policy that he was going to do away with that tariff, it doesn't look like he's going to. And lastly, we generally move freight into a location in the United States where we have inland freight charges, warehousing, and distribution costs. That has to be all factored into the supply chain landed cost model. The acquisition cost of the goods is determined by what country we buy it from, because ultimately duties and taxes that are paid are just decided by what the product is, its harmonized tariff number, and what country it originates from. The volume of our acquisition, right? The more we buy, generally the unit cost will come down. What levels of customization do we require from the supplier for our product becomes an issue. The market demand has an impact. And in our negotiation, the number of alternative options that we have will give us leverage in the negotiation process. So our ability to negotiate successfully is determined by generally our ability to have various options to leverage in that negotiation. We have to recognize when we look at sourcing models around the world that China creates a significant manufacturing capability. When Nixon opened up China in the mid-70s and things really started to take off in the 80s, and when they were eventually allowed into the world trade market in the early 2000s, they have just created a manufacturing prowess almost second to none in the whole world. Their ability to almost manufacture anything, okay, at any quantity and provide a high level of quality is really difficult for you to find any other place around the world where that's done to the same capacity as China. They have a significant amount of skilled labor at lower cost. And one of the things we have to recognize is that they moved more people through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s from poverty to middle class with that manufacturing growth. And their ability to adapt to the various circumstances that are required in the global markets that they service is second to none. But having acknowledged these great things about China, we have to recognize that there are significant issues that we have to contend with China. The first is that there's very little protection in China for intellectual property rights. I only know of one case in the last 10 years that a US company has been successful in suing within China to get back money or hold companies responsible for stealing intellectual property rights. Most attorneys who have an expertise in this area will tell you that you can make the tightest contract possible, but the differences in laws between the provinces in China and the way they navigate this particular issue, it's almost an impossible task to hold them accountable for violating intellectual property rights. Tied into IPR is forced information transfers. I'm now involved with a case in Silicon Valley where a company there has lost as much as $400 million because of a forced information transfer that they were required to do in order to have some manufacturing done there. And that information has now been stolen and used in a competitive nature against them. The forced labor issues, which I mentioned earlier, are now a much more significant concern. China's stance with North Korea, Russia, Africa, and Iran is also of concern. And now they're also, I read in the Wall Street Journal yesterday that they're taking a stance against Israel and have debarred Israel from access to certain precious materials and minerals that China supports Israel in providing. The COVID issues that I mentioned earlier, while I would still consider China a low-cost market, in fact, analysis that was done by an independent sourcing company showed that the labor costs in the last 15 years has increased by as much as 8% in China and will continue to escalate even higher as their middle class is demanding higher wages. And in some cases, the reliability, particularly that was tested through COVID, left a lot of people concerned with that market. We know that they're posturing to take back Taiwan and bring it back to the mainland. And they're also posturing that they control the waterway in the South China Sea, which is being challenged by the Philippines and the United States, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. And the general geopolitical stance that the US and the West has with China, which obviously has a huge amount of concern and complexity there. So we like to look at creating a China sourcing policy where you bring risk management into the concept. You learn what your options are and not necessarily eliminate China, but really reduce your footprint is really a better option to look at. So where would we go? So I have several engineers on staff that help companies in their alternative sourcing. And one of the first things we look at is where do we have free trade agreements? And we have them with all these countries that I've listed here. Okay, and what does that mean? That means if we purchase something in one of these countries and now import that product in as a finished product, a raw material, a component, or a part, there's no obligation to be duty because there's no duty required in the free trade agreement. And the same thing when we look for markets for export for our clients, we first go to these because if they import the product from the United States, there's no duty in their country as well. So free trade agreement countries is a tremendous opportunity for us to look for alternative sourcing. And I'll highlight a few of these in this list here. The first one coming down the line is the Dominican Republic. We've moved a number of companies out of China into the Dominican Republic. They have a very strong industry in textile, piece goods, leather goods, sportswear, sporting goods themselves. We just moved a manufacturer of baseball mitts there. They have a great capability to maneuver leather. and they're part of what's called the Caribbean Initiative Program, which again created a free trade agreement with about 16 different countries that are located in the Caribbean and in Latin America. Another country is Israel. Putting aside the issue that we currently have and the circumstances that's going on there, Israel has a significant manufacturing capability, particularly in the high-tech area. And we have moved several companies over the years out of China into Israel in that specific vertical. On the next list, you have Korea. Okay, Korea has a significant manufacturing prowess all by themselves in several different industries. Mexico, which we'll talk about in a moment, the Maquiladora program creates a tremendous option for us. And the last one down there is Singapore. Singapore, particularly in the high-tech area, has a significant manufacturing capability that we can access as well. Countries like Philippines, Turkey, Brazil, Vietnam, India, and Taiwan have all been countries around the world that we've been successful in looking as an alternative source for manufacturing. I'll highlight India in there as being probably out of this whole group one of the more favorable options, mainly because they have significantly low-cost manufacturing. They compete head-on with China. They have a good manufacturing capability. I would say the only negative relative to China is that their transportation infrastructure does not run as well as China's does. It's not as matured, but they have now made several investments in the transportation infrastructure. So we expect over the next 2 to 3 years for it to get significantly better than it is today. So the concept of near sourcing, which is really bringing manufacturing closer to where it is required or being utilized, has 3 categories underneath it. Reshoring, which is bringing manufacturing back to the United States, okay? Near sourcing, which is bringing back manufacture closer to the United States, such as Mexico or Canada or Dominican Republic. Or friendshoring, which is moving it to a country that's more allied with the United States, more of a friendly balance in our relationship. Taiwan, Malaysia, Turkey, South Korea, Vietnam would be examples of that. We kind of call all these things as near sourcing, but they really need to be looked at as 3 separate areas. One of the great options that's available to us is the Mexico Maquiladora program, which allows us to do manufacturing in Mexico, where the company in Mexico gets significant economic benefit by allowing for the goods that get imported as raw materials components to be duty-free as it comes into Mexico. But the real key is that the manufactured products now come into the United States duty-free under the USMCA agreement. We have boots on the ground in Mexico because it's such a vibrant area, and really they have low-cost manufacturing, they have significant labor capability, and just to give you a perspective, if you looked at the Fortune 1000 companies in the United States, about 40% have a direct or an indirect interest in a Mexican Maquiladora location. Foreign trade zones is another option that's available for companies to look at. And the key benefits to foreign trade zones is that we can do manufacturing, assembly, fulfillment, and distribution. It creates deferral of the duties as the goods come through the border. There's no obligation to a customs clearance. It's only once they exit the facility. And if we export the goods out of the facility, there's no obligation. We eliminate the duties altogether because the goods would never have entered the United States. Tariff inversion, when we have manufacturing or assembly, where we move the goods from one class, harmonized classification to another because we're taking a raw material and making a finished product, Customs says, whichever you get the greatest advantage of, okay, in terms of duty payment, you can declare it as the raw material or as the finished product. And typically, the finished product has a lower duty rate than does raw materials. And because of the ability to do weekly customs clearances, you can reduce your customs clearance charges and your merchandise processing fees pretty significantly. As an example, we have a supplement ingredient supplier doing about $125 million worth of business. We switched their location to a foreign trade zone. So they import the raw materials components and they finish the assembly of the product at their location in Philadelphia. So annually they save $6.5 million, okay, which is 5% on their bottom line, and they only have about $160,000 of additional costs relative to operating that foreign trade zone. So the return on the investment is pretty significant in a foreign trade zone model. We look to the area of freight as another option. Full container load, a full trailer load, is as much as 3 to 4 times less expensive per cubic meter, per kilo, per pound when compared to LCL or LTL freight. So building consolidations, being more patient in how you ship goods and so forth can save a lot of money in the supply chain. Additional issues with freight is when you start to negotiate with their various freight forwarders, custom house brokers, 3PLs, you always want to be in a situation, depending upon your size as a company, how much you spend, to really try to be a big fish in a smaller pond, possibly approaching carriers direct versus going through a service provider. You should be running RFPs, requests for proposals, at least every 2 to 3 years to keep even your incumbents sharp. Maximize utilization of technology. And lastly, learn what your options are. When salesmen come calling, see them, talk to them, and see what they have to offer, not necessarily because you're looking to make a change, but to gain information on options that are available to you. Looking at customs clearance, technology, okay, PO management systems, okay, are all options that can help reduce cost. They give you robust information flows, okay. Quality customs brokers have significant technology and PO management systems, and always appreciate that your charges that they're giving to you is always a negotiation, okay. And you should be able to benchmark what the pricing should be by talking to other companies. Duties and taxes are controlled by the country of origin and the harmonized tariff number. That process is interpretive. It should be reviewed by professionals. We look at companies' HTS numbers all the time, and on the average, 15 to as much as 20% is done incorrectly, and many times the correct harmonized tariff number will change the duty rate, generally favorably. GRIs are the general rules of interpretation. That's how customs tells us we have to interpret the regulations to make the correct choice of the harmonized tariff number. Appreciate that it changes over time, so we have to have a system of making sure we know what changes are made when they happen. And also, harmonized tariff numbers can be legitimately manipulated. It's called tariff engineering. We'll look at that in a moment. Drawback is a program that is available to customs to reclaim duties. Okay, so it allows us to go back to customs and say, hey, listen, something that we imported that we paid duties on is now being exported, and we can go back and claim up to 99% of those duties. The drawback, we have product accountability is required to show it came in and it went out. It's a documentary process. We have the ability to go back 5 years in a drawback program. We have to be able to identify things at the product code, SKU, or lot number. Ultimately, the submissions are done electronically, and most companies utilize a third party to help them facilitate their drawback programs. So a computer peripheral parts distributor in Chicago that imports $22 million of computer components pays customs duty rates ranging from 3.5% to as much as 30.5%. In its drawback program, it claims about $365,000 annually against only $36,000 of cost. Again, a high return on that option. Tariff engineering is the legitimate re-engineering and manipulation of a product in order to reduce its duty as it comes through the border. Okay, so there are lots of options that I have outlined here, and I'm kind of coming down to the last moments here, so I'm going to move a little bit quicker. So the example at the bottom one is a pharmaceutical company changes its ingredients to move it from a medical product to a supplement, which now changes the FDA requirements, and that eases the import process. Okay. The other two examples are good ones as well, where we change how something is manufactured and what it's made of, and that has a huge impact on lowering the duty rate. And appreciate the fact that this has been challenged several times by customs, and it's gone all the way up to Supreme Court. The Supreme Court continually rules that as long as the process is transparent to customs, that it is legitimate for an importer to manipulate the product in order to get duty favor. So other options is bonded warehouses, which are temporary locations to keep goods in and not having to customs clear it. Drawback program, choice of Incoterm has an impact. First sale options if we use buying agents overseas, and really continual review of the harmonized tariff numbers that's being utilized. The Incoterms, at the end of the day, is a point in time and trade where the responsibility and liability, cost and risk transfer between a seller and a buyer. So the choice of the Incoterm has a direct impact on cost and risk in your supply chain. We worked with a San Diego medical products equipment importer. Okay, they were buying CIF. The first thing we did was to see if we controlled the freight rather than the customer or the supplier in China provide the freight, and we're able to provide savings when we control the inbound freight. Furthermore, we moved the transactions to Ex Works, so it lowered the value that we declared to customs for duty purposes, okay, and that further lowered the cost in this particular circumstance. In that freight, warehousing and distribution is once it gets here to the United States, how can we lower costs? Most distribution facilities have a proximity to the gateways, but you really have to do an analysis and a study of your client demographics. The client demographics will really control through a site selection study where you should be located. And many times we move companies to have several distribution centers closer to their customers, okay, to be able to lower their distribution costs. That can be in-house or sourced. A bundling of services with 3PLs that control both freight and warehousing and distribution is an option, and always appreciate that it's a negotiation. The demand planning process, understanding that when we use air freight as compared to ocean freight, it's 18 times more expensive. So we have to look at why are we using air freight. It's usually a result of poor demand planning, and we have to rush shipments along the process, and therefore we have to use air freight. So looking at demand planning becomes another solution. Our process includes 4 steps, which is really something for you to think about. An intellectual assessment of your supply chain and how it runs, creating a financial model to create an ROI, an operational model which answers the questions, what do I have to do differently to make any of these solutions or programs happen, and then ultimately implementation. So you have all these different options that exist here. I've covered a lot of them through the presentation. I have my contact information at the end, so that'll give you, contact me if you want to go into any of these areas in more detail. Be more than happy to help. Appreciate that trade compliance is the last aspect that you need to be paying attention to. There are 28 federal agencies that we need to be concerned about. Okay, so we have to be paying attention to these issues. Additional considerations is we have to really rethink China as a supplier and as a customer. The forced labor issues, intellectual property rights, forced technology transfers is driving that. There's a residual impact to the freight disruption. Obviously, it dissipated pretty significantly at the end of last year, but always appreciate that looming if there's an imbalance in the capacity and demand, that this might increase as we get into the second quarter of 2024. The use of technology is critical, and alternative and near sourcing is something to really think about. Learning to negotiate solutions is really developing international business skills, developing a higher level of emotional intelligence, learning how to communicate internationally, developing resources such as the World Trade Center of Denver, and taking the various training programs that the World Trade Center has to offer. So with that, I'm pretty close to being a minute over, but this is my contact information, so feel free to reach out to me. And if anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to address them.